Good morning, and thank you for attending our Education and Resources Summit. This is a section of advocacy. I am Kayvan Freeman, registered nurse and care services coordinator at ALS United. I also cover the clinic at Mount Sinai and Hospital for Special Surgery, their ALS clinic. It's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers this morning, and I'm going to start with Ms. Tiffany Card. She's the Director of Communication and Advocacy at ALS United, Greater New York, leading strategies communication and advocacy since 2020. With over 15 years of advocacy and government relations, Tiffany has served as Chief of Staff in both New York City Council and New York State Assembly. A proven leader in nonprofit and public service, Tiffany has shaped policy, strengthened advocacy networks, and championed equity throughout her career. Our next speaker is Ms. Allison Nadeau. She's the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at ALS Network, where she leads national, state, and local advocacy effort to advance policies and programs that improve access to care, accelerate research, and expand resources for people living with ALS and their families. With a background in public policy and access to care and community-based programs. And we have Mr. Shea McCarthy, who is a partner at Thorn Run Partners and a consultant to ALS United, where he supports federal advocacy efforts to advance policies that improve care, expand support to families, and drive progress in ALS research and treatment. He is an experienced healthcare lobbies and policy strategies. Before joining the Thorn Run Partner, he worked on Capitol Hill in policy and public affairs roles, giving him a well-rounded perspective on how to build momentum and deliver a result in Washington. Thank you, the speakers. The floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming to our United in Advocacy Together for Change. My name is Tiffany Card, and so let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about what is advocacy and the ALS advocacy successes, our federal landscape. We're going to talk about how does ALS United pick their priorities and what those policy requests are like. We're going to go over our federal requests and legislation. We're going to take a look at state advocacy that ALS United Greater New York works on, covering New Jersey as well as New York. And then we'll take your questions and answers. And we're going to go back and forth between Shea, myself, and Allison. We're going to start off with what is advocacy?
Thanks, Tiffany. Hi, everyone. So happy to have you join us. When we talk about advocacy, we mean using lived experience to influence decisions and to create change. Advocacy can take many forms, whether it's educating your community, like we're doing today, sharing information online, organizing locally, participating in research, or speaking directly with policymakers about issues that impact the ALS community. Today, we're focusing primarily on legislative advocacy, the work that's being done at the federal and state level to improve research, access to care, financial support systems, and quality of life for people living with ALS. And one of the most important things to understand about advocacy is this: you do not need to be a policy expert to make an impact. The people most impacted by ALS bring something policymakers cannot get from a briefing paper, a data report, or a lobbyist. It's the human perspective. And so the stories shared by our community are often the moments lawmakers remember the most. These stories create urgency, they create accountability and connection. They help transform ALS from a policy issue into a human reality. And so advocacy is not theoretical. It's already changed the trajectory of ALS care, research, and access in really meaningful ways, which Tiffany is about to dive into.
So, ALS advocacy successes. Advocacy has helped turn ALS into a national priority, leading to major wins like the Act for ALS, expanded research funding, increased access to clinical trials, and emergency therapies. We also saw the Social Security disability benefit change, the ALS designation as a 100% VA service-connected disease. And last year, Senator Elizabeth Dole, 21st Century Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement. These were all accomplished by advocacy with people like you. And that means calling your representative, having virtual meetings with them, showing up at a town hall, writing an email, making a phone call, going out on social media and calling them and making them take action is what these wins were. It's persistent advocacy by people living with ALS, families, researchers, and organizations that has improved the access to multidisciplinary care, telehealth, mobility equipment, and communication devices. And kind of as Allison said, it's the personal stories that really drive change. Many of us were just in DC last week meeting with staffers from the House of Representatives as well as our Senate. And many of those people did not know what ALS was. And it was because of sharing your stories with those staffers that really made an impact on them. They listened, they heard that, they started to understand the importance of the legislation that we so often are advocating for. And every advocacy action matters. All of the emails, the meetings, the rallies, the grassroots organizing, that's what has moved the legislation that we have seen happen in the last 10 years take an effect. I'm now going to turn it over to Shea, who's going to give you a little bit more about what is lobbying in our federal landscape.
Well, that's great. Thank you for the overview, Tiffany, and the introduction. I'm Shea McCarthy. I'm a federal lobbyist based in Washington, D.C., and I have the great privilege of representing ALS United in Washington. I wanted to start by kind of starting to cover why does advocacy matter, and why does the efforts that what we do, what advocates like you contribute to, what is the impact that it truly has? Healthcare is highly regulated and deeply shaped by federal policy. Congress and federal agencies probably have as much power in terms of controlling what healthcare access, coverage, reimbursement, and research look like than almost any other domestic policy issue. The federal government in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the state government advocacy that ALS United is engaged in as well. But my focus is on federal, and when it comes to the federal government's role in health policy, it is distinctly significant. The largest investments in federal research, the largest investments in all medical research in the United States occur through the National Institutes of Health. We've seen NIH make unprecedented investments in ALS in recent years. So at the end of the day, decisions in Washington have a direct impact on ALS care, research, access, family support. We work on a wide host of issues because of the strong imprint that the federal government has in shaping health policy. And if the ALS community is not at the table, decisions get made without the people that are most affected and without their stories being in mind. What I like to say is that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And so when it comes to federal advocacy, we want a seat at the table. And that's why we actively have conversations with policymakers, their staff, schedule visits to Washington, do letter writing campaigns, and all sorts of federal advocacy work to make sure that we're at the table and not on the menu when Congress looks at ways to achieve savings and when they look for budget cuts in an environment of fiscal austerity. We want to make sure that we are not on the menu and instead at the table. So what does the lobbyist do? I'll be honest, I run into a lot of people that have a little bit of a warped perception about what someone like me does in Washington. I think that the general view of lobbying can come across as transactional. People think about smoke-filled rooms where lobbyists hand over a stack of cash or pledge a campaign donation and in exchange receive a commitment for a vote from a member of Congress. Honestly, that couldn't be farther from the truth, and that's really just not how lobbying works in practice. Now, to be fair, there is a role of leveraging things like political support and sometimes campaign donations to develop relationships, but what I'll say is that they're far from transactional. We are in an era of unprecedented transparency. Every single dollar of campaign donations is publicly disclosed, as is every single vote that a member of Congress takes. And so what does a lobbyist really do, and how does the financial aspect come into it? What I would say is it's relatively limited. Members of Congress have to be accountable to their constituents. Every vote they cast, as I mentioned, is publicly available, and they will come under a lot of criticism if there is any sign of undue process or undue influence when they decide what issues to support. What does matter is the court of public opinion and making the case to them that whatever issue that they're working on, supporting, and championing Congress is something that they're going to be able to go home to their constituents in good faith and be able to defend. So what does that mean from an advocacy perspective? That what an effective lobbyist can do is help a member of Congress connect an issue to their district, to help understand why the people they represent are directly impacted. And a lot of this gets back to what Allison said at the outset. Sharing the stories of individual advocates arms them with talking points that when they go to the Washington and pass a major initiative like the Act for ALS, which we're currently working to reauthorize, unprecedented federal investments in research and access to experimental ALS therapies, that they're able to relay to other voters why ALS matters, what they heard from someone in their district. The powerful stories of constituents are what can end up winning the day in terms of determining what a member of Congress is to be supportive of. And as a lobbyist, it's our job to elevate those stories, to create the relationships that provide access to make sure those stories can actually get to elected officials, and ultimately to make sure that the perspectives of advocates, families, clinicians, and researchers ultimately make it to their federal officials.
Great.
The last thing I'll say will sort of tee up a couple of the specific issues that Allison and Tiffany are going to share that we're working on at a federal level. I just wanted to explain at a high level how to think about the various aspects of how we try to navigate federal policy. The old schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes a law. There's some truth to the process of kind of following bills through the legislative process, but a good way to look at how we navigate federal policy and the lanes that we tend to operate in. There's basically three major types of legislation that we try to pass. And to understand how to work with Congress and how we advocate for the federal government, it's helpful to at least understand these three kind of major lanes. Firstly, there are major changes in policy. We call this authorizing legislation, creating brand new laws, creating brand new programs, things like the ALS Better Care Act, for example, which I think Tiffany will share a little bit more about in a few moments, where we're looking to completely overhaul the way that, in this case, the Medicare program pays for certain policies. This is what we call authorizing legislation, and it tells the federal agencies in the administration what rules they have to follow. And so these authorizing legislation, this type of authorizing legislation refers to the major bills that make major policy changes. On the other hand, there are reauthorizations. This is what we're trying to do with Act for ALS, a program that has already made major changes in policy that has an expiration date and needs to be extended. Now, with these authorizations, sometimes you will see minor tweaks to the programs and policy, like you would see in an authorizing bill, but generally speaking, a reauthorization and the goal of something like that is for a program that has existed for some period of time. It has an expiration date. Congress has to go through the process of determining, did this program achieve our goals? Was this a worthwhile use of federal funds? And is this something that we want to continue? Reauthorization bills are basically extensions of authorizing legislation and comprise an important part of making sure that the programs that we create can continue to flourish and in some case make needed improvements to make sure that they continue to meet their stated need. And then finally is appropriations, or maybe better said, federal spending. Appropriations bills are really the ones that actually dedicate money to the programs and policies that are created both through authorizing legislation and reauthorizations. Just because Congress creates a new policy or program doesn't necessarily mean that it has dedicated federal funding behind it. Through the dedicated process called the appropriations process, Congress actually allocates specific amounts of funding to federal programs. And for all intents and purposes, a program that has been authorized or in some cases reauthorized might not have the impact that is intended without Congress also dedicating that funding through the appropriations process. So we oftentimes have to operate in multiple lanes at the same time, create these major programs or reauthorize them on one hand, and then ensure Congress is dedicating funding to them on the other hand. So with that background in mind, you'll hear a little bit more about how we're looking to navigate the federal government and advance some really meaningful policies that are going to improve access, care, coverage, and more for ALS community. With that, I'll turn it back over to Tiffany and Allison.
Thank you, Shea. That was great. Next, we're going to talk a little bit. People often ask, how do you pick pieces of legislation to advocate for? So Allison's going to talk a little bit more about our priorities and what goes into those decisions.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. And in order for Shea to do his job effectively and efficiently, the ALS United organization needs to make sure we clearly understand what the community needs so he can do that work on our behalf. In late 2024, ALS United conducted a national survey to better understand the priorities and concerns of the community and to help ensure that our advocacy efforts were really reflecting the realities of what people are facing every day. What emerged from that data were three clear themes. The first is expanding research and clinical trial access. The second, strengthening financial support systems. And the third, improving healthcare access and coverage. These priorities reflect the full ALS experience, from navigating diagnosis and care, to accessing treatments and clinical trials, to managing the financial and caregiving realities that come with this disease. And so our advocacy strategy is intentionally flexible and very community informed so that we use both lived experience and data to help guide where we focus our efforts and how we respond to emerging policy opportunities. These priorities ultimately shape the federal and state advocacy work that's happening today across the community that you're going to learn a little bit more about. While advocacy work happens across many of our issues, there are three major federal priorities that are driving much of our policy conversations this year. The first is the Act for ALS Reauthorization Act. Then we have the ALS Better Care Act, our federal funding requests, and continued bipartisan engagement through the Congressional ALS Caucus. Together, these priorities focus on accelerating research, protecting access to multidisciplinary care, and ensuring ALS remains visible and prioritized at the federal level. Over the next several slides, we're going to walk through each of these priorities in more detail, including why they matter, where things currently stand, and how they impact the ALS community. So Tiffany, back to you.
The first one we're going to talk about is appropriations or federal funding. So typically, a budget cycle runs from October 1st through September 30th. And Congress votes on how much money to allocate for different departments and for the country at large, whether that's the Department of Defense or Health and Human Services or the National Institutes of Health. And they look for requests from folks. So we come together with a group of ALS organizations, as well as a coalition of other organizations that also rely on this funding, and gather and discuss, what do we think we need? What do we think is possible? And we never get what we need, but we could always get more. But what do we also think is possible? So this past year, unfortunately, because Congress could not come to a consensus, they continued to pass a continuing resolution. So basically, they kick the can down the road. They keep the funding where it is as they get more time to allow themselves to come to a consensus. And finally, that happened in February of 26. So while they were supposed to pass the budget on October 1st of 2025 for this year, it didn't happen until February. However, despite all of that, we actually ended up securing $45 million increase in federal funding for ALS, which included the $90 million for the Act for ALS, as well as $40 million for the DoD. They are the Department of Defense that really is interested in doing research around why is ALS a service-connected disease for veterans. $145 million plus for the National Institute of Health, and the continued $10 million for the CDC National ALS Registry. New this year was the $30 million for ARPA-H. ARPA-H is advanced research projects for the Department of Health. It's a federal agency designed to accelerate breakthrough health innovations by funding high-risk, high-reward research that traditional systems often cannot support. Sometimes you'll hear people reference a moonshot. Thinking of Kennedy, we're going to get to the moon in 10 years. What kind of funding do we need to do that? So it's sort of in that realm when we think about that. So that was this past year. In March of this year, our coalition came together again to work out and send a letter to Congress for our requests for 2027. That again would be a budget that would start October 1st of 2026 and run through September 30th of 2027. You can see here we're requesting $100 million, which was in the bill for the Act for ALS, recommended $100 million to actually complete the Act for ALS as written. We also have increased support for the Department of Defense funding to $80 million. We've done this every year. We have been trying to double the amount because the amount of proposals that come to the DoD for research are almost, if not more, than $80 million. Unfortunately, because it's only $40 million right now, they are only able to fund about half of the proposals that come to the Department of Defense. We need to hopefully get the $30 million back for ARPA-H, research and clinical trials. We're asking for a $20 million increase in the National Institute of Health, a $15 million increase for the CDC registry. And also new this year is we want to see an investment of $9 million through the VA to establish ALS research, education, and clinical care centers to improve care coordination and clinical trial access for veterans living with ALS. At the moment, this is all in process. They're going through this process. They already have all the information. And these language bills hopefully will come out through over the summer and before September 30th. Although, as in past years, it's very possible that we could see another continuing resolution. I'll switch over to Allison for the Act for ALS reauthorization.
The Act for ALS originally passed in 2021 with overwhelming bipartisan support after years of advocacy from the ALS community. It passed the House 423-3 and unanimously in the Senate. The legislation was created in response to two urgent realities. People living with ALS cannot wait for the traditional pace of drug development, and ALS research needed stronger national coordination and infrastructure. The law helps to address those challenges by supporting shared research and data infrastructure, strengthening that collaboration between government, researchers, and industry, and expanding access to investigational therapies for people who may not qualify for clinical trials. And since the passage, these programs have already helped to support large national research initiatives, expanded access programs across more than 40 clinical sites, and has had collaborative efforts really accelerating progress throughout the ALS field. Reauthorization of this legislation is critical because many of these programs were operating in silos, and this is the first time we are seeing this shared data infrastructure, and we can't allow that to slow. Many of these programs begin expiring after September 30th, 2026. Without congressional action, momentum could be lost at a pivotal moment in ALS research and therapeutic development. The good news is that reauthorization efforts are already moving forward in Congress. The House bill has successfully advanced out of the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee with currently 55 bipartisan co-sponsors and continues to move through the legislative process. A companion bill, which is the same bill that's up in the Senate, was introduced, reflecting really strong bipartisan support and continued momentum behind the scenes for these programs. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Thank you. Now we're going to talk about the next piece of legislation that we are actively working on, which is the ALS Better Care Act. So many of you are very familiar with multidisciplinary care. It is the gold standard for people living with ALS. It has been shown to extend life based on all of the different disciplines that get seen at a clinic, where neurologists, therapists, respiratory, speech, nutrition, social work, nursing, and mental health providers coordinate care in one visit. However, right now, Medicare sees that visit as a one-time, one payment, as if you were seeing one doctor, when in reality, you're seeing a whole host as a whole medical team. So the ALS Better Care Act is a bipartisan fix that fixes Medicare reimbursement so it reflects how ALS care is actually delivered. The team-based model, as I said, is evidence-based and it's shown to improve quality of life. The current Medicare rules reimburse providers separately and inadequately, forcing ALS clinics to operate at a loss and in some cases reduce services or close. The bill creates a new supplemental Medicare payment of about $800 per visit to properly reimburse comprehensive ALS clinic care as a single coordinated service. Without it, access to high-quality disciplinary ALS care is at risk. With it, the existing care model can be sustained and strengthened nationwide. We are seeing many clinics across the country question whether or not, or a university or hospital setting question whether or not that clinic actually serves the hospital or the university setting. Many of them are losing money. And we want to make sure that that is not the case. If universities and hospital settings knew that they were going to get this $800 supplemental payment, they are more likely to grow. We could see universities and hospitals actually invest in clinic care and grow those clinics in areas that don't already have a clinic, thereby making sure that we don't have clinic deserts. Allison?
So the final federal priority that we want to touch on today is continuing to expand engagement and involvement in the Congressional ALS Caucus and why it matters so much to the advocacy efforts that we do in Washington. A caucus is an informal bipartisan group of members of Congress who come together around a shared issue or community. In this case, the ALS Caucus is made up of lawmakers who have made a commitment to learning about and supporting issues that impact our community. And while caucuses do not directly pass legislation themselves, they play a really important role in building awareness, relationships, and momentum around those shared policy priorities. The ALS Caucus helps to educate congressional offices on ALS-related issues, build long-term champions in Congress, identify potential co-sponsors and supporters for different pieces of legislation, and really elevate ALS as an ongoing bipartisan priority. One of the most important things to understand about advocacy work is that relationships really matter. Congressional offices that participate in the caucus are more engaged in ALS conversations. They're more likely to attend briefings and events and are familiar with the challenges facing this community. Caucus members are often among the first offices that we approach for legislative support, letters of support, and policy leadership. And importantly, bipartisan engagement matters deeply. ALS impacts people regardless of political party, geography, or background. And many of the major ALS policy wins over the last decade have succeeded because of that continued collaboration. So as the ALS Caucus continues to grow, it sends a visible signal that support for our community remains strong and that these issues continue to matter at the federal level. So go ahead, Tiffany.
So that was our federal picture. We're now going to kind of dive into our state work. So ALS United Greater New York covers New Jersey and New York. And we focus on protecting access to care, strengthening research funding, advancing policies that directly impact people living with ALS and their families on a state level. Last year, both New York and New Jersey secured wins with the establishment of the state registries. So while the CDC registry that you may be familiar with nationwide is a self-reporting mechanism, ALS registry in New Jersey and New York is a mandated registry, which means that clinical professionals, once a person gets an ALS diagnosis, would be reporting that data anonymously through the DOH. This will better inform our research and look at possible environmental causes and where are pockets. Do we have zip codes that we're seeing more cases or not? This will be huge impact on the research that we are able to do in New Jersey and New York. Yesterday, ALS United Greater New York was joined by a coalition in Albany advocating for the Dennis Crowley Genetic Testing Privacy Act. This bill would protect individuals from discrimination based on genetic testing results, ensuring people can access testing and research without fear that it will affect life, disability, or long-term care insurance. New York continues to push for sustained ALS funding and stronger support for clinical care, research participation, and family services. For many years now, New York as well as New Jersey receives state funding through the state budget process. If many of you are living in New York, you know that we still do not have a state budget. The state budget is typically due by April 1st, and it's now May 15th, and we do not have a budget, and they are supposed to end session June 4th. So we will see what happens with that. Unfortunately, what that does is it causes any other legislation trying to get through that process to stall. So stay tuned on that. For New Jersey, in the past years, funding was included in the governor's budget, which usually is proposed right at the beginning of the year in February. Last year, for the first time, or one of the first times, Governor Murphy eliminated all nonprofit funding due to the budget crisis, but through advocacy for phone calls and Zoom visits and virtual visits, we were able to secure $325,000 last year for New Jersey. Unfortunately, the new governor did the same thing this year. They zeroed out all nonprofit funding. So we are back knocking on doors, going to Zoom meetings, going to in-person meetings, contacting New Jersey State Assembly members and Senate to make sure that we can continue to give the best care in the state of New Jersey. We split that funding with ALS United Mid-Atlantic. So across both states, advocates are working to protect and expand these gains so families have access to care today and better treatments tomorrow. Now, how do you get involved? What can you do? You can visit the website that is here that gives our public priorities. You'll take action alerts on that whole page. And if you take your phone right now, you can scan that QR code that will bring up our sign up. And you can sign up and make sure that you are getting all the latest advocacy news from Greater New York. Get involved in going and being part of virtual visits, or sign up to join us in Albany or Trenton or on a Zoom meeting. So I will leave that there for a second. And I think we are about ready to take questions, Kayvan.
Well, thank you so much. It was such an excellent presentation that I think if I'm start questioning, you have answered most of the question, but however, I'm going to do it. Is it okay?
Go for it.
All right. Actually, the first question was, what is the best way to advocate and to join the group that make the difference? I think that was the last slide, actually, that you left it for a couple of seconds.
Yeah.
Would you like to say a little bit more about it for those that a little worry and they may think they are not up to the par? There is a language problem, there is a whatever, you know, so make it easier for them.
Sure, we do trainings like this, several times a year. Our ALS United members also do trainings. I know a lot of these trainings exist on YouTube. They exist on our YouTube channel. So if someone was a little apprehensive about going to their meeting, what do they say? How do they do it? They can always be directed to some of these videos. It gives a great example of how to tell your story. Allison and Shea, if you want to pipe in, go ahead.
Thanks, Tiffany. Honestly, something to keep in mind is to get involved is to start where you are. That can look like joining action alerts, attending advocacy days, to Tiffany's point, meeting virtually with elected officials, sharing your story. But there are also opportunities where you're posting education on your social media, educating family members, community members, participating in research. And making a difference is about sustained engagement. And policymakers hear statistics all day long, but they remember the people. They remember the caregivers talking about navigating care. They remember the veterans living with ALS. They remember the families explaining the financial and the emotional impact of the disease. And you don't have to do it alone. Tiffany at ALS United, at ALS Network, at advocacy coalitions, they all help to provide that training, those talking points, and those opportunities to engage so that people can participate in whatever feels comfortable. So start where you are, sign up online, and we will help you take that next step.
You all covered it well.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And as you said, most probably no matter what state you are, you can reach out to your chapter or just get help from them and move on from there. The other question is, have you noticed any difference in response or access to the representative in the past few years? Especially as you know, ALS is a disease, basically is a quiet one. even I, as registered nurse, maybe past 30, 40 years, I don't want to go too far back, really, we didn't know much about ALS. They would say motor neuron disease, and they left it at that. So with the ice bucket, the challenge that we had, it really was phenomenal, not only in United States, but all over the world. So have you noticed any responses recently that it's made the difference? Sorry.
I think you're onto something, Kayvan, which is there seems to be these viral or social media moments. I think that when well-known people unfortunately also get a diagnosis, for example, most recently Eric Dane, that seemed to make a big difference. I know that Eric Dane did a lot of advocacy. He went on the Hill. He met with Congress people. His ability to get into the news and get in front of cameras and in the press and on social media feels like it made people aware of it again. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we see these waves where it kind of hits that high point because of a celebrity, and then unfortunately it goes quiet again. But I think the sustained mobility over the last 5-7 years, the advocacy, the kind of banging on the pot, right? It's not a one and done. Even though we went to DC last week and I was in Albany yesterday, we are constantly in contact with those legislators and those legislator aides. I know that Allison in particular has been working behind the scenes on the Act for ALS. So those conversations and that constant engagement is something that I think is different. I think people really understand that that has made an impact. I think people get discouraged when they think, oh, I've been doing this for 10 years and nothing has happened. The ALS community has been doing this a long time, and we actually are seeing changes.
Tiffany, I agree. I do think there has been noticeable changes over the past several years, both in responsiveness and in how congressional offices engage with advocates and constituents. On one hand, there's actually more accessibility in some ways than there used to be. Virtual meetings, Zoom advocacy days, digital action alerts, social media engagement, to your point, and those district office access have made it a lot easier for more people, especially people with disabilities or chronic illness, to participate in advocacy without needing to travel to Washington. So many offices now rely heavily on those virtual constituent engagements and that digital outreach. Also, offices are receiving significantly more incoming communication than they did a decade ago. They receive massive volumes of emails and advocacy messages and digital outreach, which can make it harder for individual voices to break through. However, they're hearing it at such a volume that it creates this sustained, continued conversation for relationship building and strategic engagement. This digital opportunity has really elevated the ALS voice that wasn't there previously and eliminated some of that travel difficulty that is just a complex aspect of living with ALS. Also, I think it's important to reiterate Tiffany's point of when there are high-level celebrities or people in the public media that are unfortunately joining the community, that brings attention to a topic that is really heavy and allows for larger conversations across different news and media outlets, really elevating the community needs and the discussion that's happening every single day between organizations like ourselves.
Allison and Tiffany, I think you all covered it well. What I can just add is a little bit of context for where this engagement has gotten us. At the federal level, despite being a rare disease, the ALS community has the single biggest accomplishment of any single disease area over the last decade. The Act for ALS represents the most notable federal investment in research and access to care of any disease. It means that we're punching above our weight. It means the momentum that we have is real. And it means that the time that advocates are spending to contact their legislators is actually having an impact. So with momentum comes opportunity, and we've created opportunities for additional growth and continue that momentum into something that is sustainable when it comes to reauthorizing these programs, and areas for growth when it comes to additional opportunities like the ALS Better Care Act.
Okay, very good. So what are the trends in getting money for ALS, say, over the past 10 years? Any differences you notice? Or basically still people are not ready to dish out?
Tiffany,
go ahead, Shea.
I was just speaking that to some effect when discussing the recent investments through Act for ALS. They've been incredibly significant and not only meaningful, unprecedented. There are plenty of other disease states that have significantly more impacted individuals. ALS is a rare disease, and yet we have seen Congress invest near $100 million annually in the success of this program. For my part, I take a wide view of what patient advocacy in Washington looks like, and plenty of other communities are clawing for $10 million in funding at NIH. This is just all to say that the federal investments in ALS have been unique. The advocacy that we've done has led to Congress sort of viewing ALS as an area that has unmet needs that distinguish ALS from not only other diseases at large, even other neurodegenerative diseases. And so, Tiffany, you may have something to add, but that's just sort of my 2 cents based on what I've seen over the last decade in my career in Washington.
We've definitely seen growth in funding despite budget concerns, despite, whatever is going on in Congress. And just a story to put this in perspective, as Shea was mentioning regarding other diseases, sadly, last year, the CDMRP program, which is where the DoD has their funding of $40 million, originally was cut out of our budget for a while. And through a lot of advocacy at the last minute, that was actually added back in to the Department of Defense funding. And unfortunately, programs that get funding like MS did not get their funding at that same time. They lost out. They were originally in the budget, all supposed to be funded. And last spring, when a lot of cuts were happening, and we were afraid that we were going to lose that funding, that $40 million was added back in. So, who did that or why, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm just going to move on and be happy that it's there. But there are diseases, to Shea's point, that sadly are losing out and not getting the kind of funding that they all deserve, right? No one deserves to be cut out of this budget. Every disease matters. That's, just kind of a small example of what we have seen.
I would also like to add that there has been an increase in bipartisan recognition that ALS requires sustained federal investment, and also federal investment in the infrastructure, not just one-time research grants. That's a major shift to where things were 5 to 10 years ago. Investing in systems that make research and therapy development possible. Programs like the Act for ALS helped create much closer collaboration between NIH, FDA, industry, researchers, and nonprofits, because historically a lot of ALS worked in silos. And with that investment, we are seeing continued progress through shared data sets, biomarkers, natural history studies, and public-private partnerships. So that trend towards investment is also investing in the infrastructure that the ALS community needs outside of just funding.
Okay. So I know it's not that easy to get to the representative and basically get the appointment also. But what happened if you did get appointment, you see them, excuse me, and they act very nice and pleasant, but there is no money coming. So how do you deal with that?
I'm going to let Shea take that one.
There's a couple ways to address that. Firstly, legislators are faced with competing priorities and tough decisions. I meet with a member of Congress or their staff multiple times every day. And very frequently, I'm one of 6 or 8 or 10 meetings that they have on their schedule that day. It means that you have to make tough decisions about how to spend your time and about how to prioritize. It also means that the squeaky wheel, or the person that follows up, that maintains the relationship, are the ones that are able to get their priorities across the finish line. Your story can have an impact. The staffer can genuinely care, and they can still forget to close the loop with the member of Congress. The member of Congress can be interested, but something else comes up and they forget to sign on to the bill, even though they committed to do it. That's why the relationships that we generate during trips to Washington, through letters and correspondence with members of Congress, the work doesn't always stop there. Relationship development means following up periodically, making sure that follow-up happens. And, the answer is that with 535 members of Congress, we don't need every single one of them to follow through on their commitments to get things over the finish line. We have to cultivate strong champions over time. And ultimately, the more champions that we have, the more likely we are to have that success. So it's easy to be discouraged after you maybe have a good conversation, but you don't see that immediately translating into action from that legislator. And it's just important to remember that sometimes advocacy takes time. The fruits of our labor oftentimes don't show up for months or even years down the road, but it doesn't mean that we're not having an impact.
It's also a very normal part of advocacy work. And honestly, it's one of the most important things to remember when you start engaging in advocacy early on, that the good meeting, Shea, to your point, doesn't translate into immediate funding or immediate legislative action. Congressional offices can be genuinely supportive of the issue while still operating in a very real political, budgetary, and within committee restraints. And it's that relationship development that you get from the first meeting, which is about introducing the issue, building familiarity, establishing trust, and helping the office really understand why ALS matters to their constituent. Sometimes offices are supportive philosophically, but are waiting for appropriations timing, which is that budget framework, leadership direction, committee negotiations, budget offsets, or that broader political momentum. And it could have nothing to do with your relationship or your story or the even very detailed specific thing that needs to happen right away. There is so much going on congressionally and with the government that is outside of our control. And sometimes the impact of your advocacy is invisible in the moment. But the staffer who heard your story that day may remember that conversation months down the line when a funding letter or an amendment or a bill comes across their desk. And so that's why, to Shea's point, that follow-up and sustained engagement matters so much.
I'll just give a quick short example of that before we close out for the hour. While we were in DC, we were meeting with a member of House representative from New Jersey. And we had a constituent of his who had just seen him at a town hall the week before. And it was like, you know, hey, how you doing? He's like, oh, yep, I'm here again. Wow, you came to DC. Yep, and I'm going to be at your next town hall. And I'm going to be sending you another email. And I'm going to be calling you on the phone. And the staffer and the person who was there from New Jersey, the constituent, right, the family connected to ALS, they had a close relationship. You know, they were joking around. And so those relationship and that relationship building is so key for advocacy. It is really what can move the needle. It is a lot harder to look at your friend and tell them, I'm sorry, I can't do anything for you. When you've established that relationship building, they're at least going to maybe explain to you why, which sometimes goes a long way to figure out, okay, well, if I can't do it this way, tell me how I can fix the problem. So that sustained engagement, I think, is one of the key pieces to all of advocacy.
Well, I think it's excellent, really, presentation. There are a couple of questions, but you've covered it already, so we don't want to go over it. And also, I wanted to thank all the attending and hope that we find a cure, medication, or whatever for this disease, and put the name of Lou Gehrig to rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you all.